Welcome to another deep dive into Serial Killer Files by Skoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're exploring a case that shattered families across multiple states and left investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about serial killers. This is the story of Glen Rogers, a man whose charm was as deadly as his knife, whose lies were as twisted as his crimes, and whose final claims would shake one of America's most infamous murder cases to its core. Picture this. It's a Friday night in 1995. You're at your local bar, maybe drowning your sorrows after a tough week, when a charismatic stranger approaches. He's got that magnetic personality that draws you in, smooth-talking, confident, the kind of guy who could pick up women in a bar as easy as you and me tying our shoes, as one witness would later describe. He offers to buy you a drink, maybe give you a ride home. You think you've met Prince Charming? You couldn't be more wrong. This was Glen Rogers' hunting ground. Bars, state fairs, any place where vulnerable women might be found drinking alone. And Rogers? He could work a bar the way a chef shops a produce stand, methodically selecting his victims with terrifying precision. But Rogers wasn't your typical serial killer. While most predators stick to familiar territory, Rogers was different, deadlier. He operated like a deadly storm system, moving across state lines in what investigators would later call short, intense spurts separated by hours or days. This wasn't a long, drawn-out campaign in one geographic area. This was a cross-country rampage that left law enforcement scrambling to connect the dots. His victims shared chilling similarities. They were redheads or strawberry blondes in their 20s and 30s. Single mothers, women living alone, bargoers with unstable lifestyles, people Rogers identified as vulnerable, trusting, hurting. Women who appeared lonely and might be easier to charm and manipulate. The method was always the same: gain their trust, offer them a ride, isolate them in a motel room, apartment, or even their own home. Then the charm would disappear, replaced by something far more sinister. Our story begins not with a vulnerable woman in a bar, but with an act of kindness that would cost a man his life. Mark Peters was 71 years old, a retired electrician and veteran from Hamilton, Ohio. When Glen Rogers was down on his luck, Peters did what any decent person might do. He offered Rogers a place to stay. It was the last kind act Peters would ever perform. In January 1994, investigators made a gruesome discovery in a remote cabin belonging to Rogers' family in Beattyville, Kentucky. Peters' skeletal remains were found bound to a chair and hidden beneath a pile of furniture. The elderly man's car, antiques, guns, and coin collection had vanished along with Rogers. The cause of death couldn't be precisely determined due to decomposition, but the circumstances told the story. The binding, the concealment. This wasn't an accident. This was cold-blooded murder of a man whose only crime was showing compassion to a drifter. But Peters was just the beginning. Rogers had discovered something about himself in that remote Kentucky cabin. Something that would drive him to cross the country, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. By 1995, Rogers had refined his technique. Sandra Gallagher was 33 years old and a mother of 3 when she made the fatal mistake of trusting Glen Rogers. She was last seen with him at a bar in Van Nuys, California. Another vulnerable woman Rogers had charmed in his preferred hunting ground. The next day brought a scene that would haunt investigators for years. Gallagher's badly burned body was discovered inside her pickup truck, parked near Rogers' apartment. She had been strangled before the fire. Rogers' attempt to destroy evidence and delay discovery. But this wasn't just about killing. This was about power, control, and a twisted methodology that Rogers was perfecting with each victim. The strangulation showed his preference for personal, brutal methods over impersonal weapons like firearms. The fire demonstrated his calculating nature, always thinking about how to cover his tracks. Rogers stole Gallagher's belongings and disappeared, already hunting for his next victim. He was becoming bolder, more confident, more dangerous. The trail led next to Mississippi, where Rogers encountered Linda Price at a beer tent during the Mississippi State Fair. Price was 34, a single mother with 2 teenagers, and exactly the type of woman Rogers preferred. Vulnerable, trusting, alone. Rogers didn't just kill Price and run. He moved in with her, living in her Jackson apartment like a parasite before striking. On November 3, 1995, Price's body was discovered in the bathtub of that same apartment. She had been stabbed to death. This marked an evolution in Rogers' methodology. The bathtub would become his signature, a twisted calling card that investigators would soon recognize. But more disturbing was Rogers' willingness to integrate himself into his victims' lives before destroying them. He wasn't just an opportunistic killer anymore. He was a predator who enjoyed the psychological game as much as the physical violence. November 5, 1995, Gibsonton, Florida. Tina Marie Cribbs, a 34-year-old mother of 2, was enjoying a night out at a local bar when Glen Rogers approached her table. Witnesses watched him buy Cribbs and her friends drinks, working his charm, convincing her to give him a ride. They went to a Tampa motel together. It would be the last decision Tina Mary Cribbs would ever make. A few days later, cleaning staff made a discovery that would define the case against Rogers. Cribbs' body lay in the bathtub of Rogers' rented room. She had been stabbed twice, wounds 8 to 9 inches deep in the chest and buttocks. But here's what made this murder particularly heinous. The medical examiner testified that the knife had been twisted before being withdrawn, indicating a deliberately violent and painful killing designed to maximize suffering. The night before her body was discovered, Rogers had paid for an extra night at the motel and specifically requested that the room not be cleaned. Witnesses saw him leaving with his belongings in a white car, calmly checking out while Cribbs's body lay decomposing in the bathroom. Investigators found Rogers' fingerprints on Cribbs' wallet and throughout the motel room. This was the evidence they needed, solid, forensic proof connecting Rogers to murder. The killing spree wasn't over. On November 9, 1995, Andy Giles Sutton was found dead in her Bossier City, Louisiana apartment. Her body was discovered on a punctured waterbed, stabbed to death in what had become Rogers' signature style. But something happened after this murder that gave investigators unprecedented insight into Rogers' twisted psychology. According to reports, Rogers spoke to Sutton's naked body while assaulting it, saying, "I did it again. She was a bad girl, but I'm making her pay for it, just like you made us pay Mommy." This cryptic statement revealed something terrifying about Rogers' motivations. These weren't random killings or crimes of opportunity. There was a deeper, more disturbed psychological component. Rogers was acting out some twisted fantasy, making these women pay for something, perhaps connected to his relationship with his mother, perhaps stemming from some deeper trauma that had warped his mind beyond recognition. What made Glen Rogers so dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was his methodology. People who knew him described him as magnetic, someone who could talk most people into doing anything. He was a master manipulator who understood exactly how to spot vulnerability and exploit it. Rogers fits the pattern of what criminologists call a mobile serial killer, but with a unique twist. Unlike territorial killers who operate in specific areas, like Atlanta's Wayne Williams or Rochester's Arthur Shawcross, Rogers moved constantly. He was more comparable to killers like Christopher Wilder or the team of Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown, who killed in rapid bursts across multiple states. This mobility made him particularly elusive. Rogers would meet victims in one state, kill them, then travel hundreds of miles to select his next target. His background as a carnival worker gave him the perfect cover, constantly moving, always having a reason to be somewhere new, never staying long enough for patterns to emerge. His victim selection was methodical and consistent. He targeted women who seemed vulnerable, those drinking alone or drowning their sorrows. Once he gained their trust through charm and persuasion, he would isolate them, often taking them to motels, apartments, or private residences. The murders themselves were brutal and personal. Rogers preferred stabbing or strangulation, methods that required him to be close to his victims, to watch them die. In multiple cases, bodies were found in bathtubs, a signature that investigators believe held some psychological significance for Rogers. By late 1995, law enforcement across multiple states had begun connecting the dots. A series of murders involving similar victims, similar methods, and a mysterious man who charmed women in bars before they disappeared. Traditional detective work combined with emerging technology as surveillance footage from gas stations, toll booths, and convenience stores was cross-referenced with witness reports and license plate numbers. The FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force coordinated the investigation, tracking Rogers' known travel patterns between carnival circuits, motels, and temporary work sites. Each lead, however small, was meticulously logged and shared between agencies. The breakthrough came when police in Kentucky spotted a distinctive vehicle, one that belonged to Tina Marie Cribbs, the Florida woman who had disappeared weeks earlier. Officers set up a discreet stakeout at a highway rest area and waited. When Rogers arrived to refuel, police moved with precision, surrounding the vehicle. His reaction was initially calm but wary. He attempted to give a false name, but officers were prepared, quickly verifying his identity through fingerprints and previous criminal records. On November 13, 1995, after weeks of coordinated investigation across dozens of law enforcement agencies, Glen Rogers' cross-country killing spree finally came to an end. What happened next would make Glen Rogers infamous far beyond his actual crimes. Almost immediately after his arrest, Rogers began talking. According to investigative reports, he went on for 4 hours, unable to stop speaking during his interrogation. When investigators told him they were considering him for 5 murders, Rogers laughed. It wasn't 5, he claimed. It was more like 70. 70 murders. The number was staggering, potentially making Rogers one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Given his background working for carnivals and traveling widely across the country, he certainly had the opportunity. The confession triggered investigations across more than 200 jurisdictions, where Rogers was believed to have passed through. Cold cases were reopened. Unsolved murders were re-examined. In some places, investigators even conducted digs based on tips that Rogers might have hidden bodies during his cross-country wanderings. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed possible that Rogers had been operating on an unprecedented scale. But then, just as quickly as the confession had come, Rogers recanted. Within weeks, he claimed he had been joking when he said he'd committed 70 murders. He insisted his presence near times and places of disappearances was pure coincidence, that he was simply unlucky rather than murderous. This reversal shattered the momentum behind many reopened investigations. Without credible forensic evidence, reliable eyewitness testimony, or clear physical links to other victims, it became nearly impossible to tie additional cold case murders to Rogers. The behavior mirrored that of other serial killers who overconfessed in prison for notoriety, only to retract later when attention waned. But the damage was done. Families of unsolved cases were left wondering. Resources had been diverted, and Rogers had achieved exactly what many believe he wanted: nationwide infamy. Just when investigators thought they had heard everything from Glen Rogers, he made a claim that would shake one of America's most infamous murder cases to its very foundation. In 2012, a documentary titled My Brother the Serial Killer explored Rogers' crimes and included an explosive allegation that would captivate the nation. According to Rogers' brother Clay, Glen had claimed responsibility for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, the 1994 double homicide that had riveted America during O.J. Simpson's trial of the century. The claims were detailed and disturbing. Rogers allegedly told his brother that he had met Nicole Brown Simpson and declared he was going to take her down. According to the documentary, Rogers claimed that O.J. Simpson had hired him to break into Nicole's house to steal expensive jewelry, adding that Simpson told him, "You may have to kill the bitch." Rogers had corresponded with criminal profiler Anthony Mioli beginning in 2009, writing letters and creating paintings that allegedly referenced his involvement in the murders. During a prison meeting, Rogers provided what seemed to be inside knowledge of the crime scene. The family supported these claims, saying Rogers had told them he worked for Nicole in 1994 and had made verbal threats against her. Rogers reportedly gave detailed video statements about his alleged actions to his attorney, though these statements were never publicly released. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Rogers' history of lies and recanted confessions casts serious doubt on these explosive claims. Law enforcement's response to Rogers' Nicole Simpson claims was swift and definitive. The LAPD stated unequivocally, "We know who killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. We have no reason to believe that Mr. Rogers was involved." Fred Goldman, Ron Goldman's father, emphasized that the evidence presented in the criminal trial proved that O.J. Simpson, and not Glen Rogers, was the murderer. Critics noted that much of the supposed evidence came from Rogers' own statements, his brother's recollections, and symbolic items like paintings, with no physical or forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene. The timeline and details of Rogers' alleged story contained inconsistencies that raised serious questions about reliability. This was, after all, the same man who had claimed to kill 70 people only to later say he was joking. The same man who had spent years manipulating situations and people to serve his own twisted purposes. Rogers was never charged in connection with the Brown-Goldman murders. The official conclusion remains that O.J. Simpson was responsible, and Rogers' claims remain unproven and largely dismissed by authorities. But the speculation fueled public curiosity and debate, keeping Rogers' name in the headlines even as he sat on death row. Glen Rogers was executed on May 15, 2025, in Florida for the 1995 murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. He also had a death sentence in California for the 1995 strangulation of Sandra Gallagher. His execution concluded his confirmed involvement in the murders for which he was convicted, leaving his other claims unresolved and largely dismissed by authorities. In the end, Rogers was convicted of killing at least 2 women, Tina Marie Cribbs and Sandra Gallagher. Strong evidence suggested he was responsible for the deaths of Linda Price, Andy Giles Sutton, and Mark Peters as well. 5 confirmed or strongly suspected victims, not the 70 he once claimed. But the true scope of Rogers' crimes may never be fully known. His mobility, his targeting of vulnerable populations, and his willingness to lie make it impossible to separate fact from fiction in many cases. Investigators noted that he preyed on vulnerable women all his adult life, suggesting a pattern of violence that extended far beyond his confirmed murders. The women Rogers killed were often marginalized: single mothers, women struggling with addiction or instability, people whose disappearances might not attract immediate attention. Their social vulnerability made them easier targets for someone with Rogers' manipulative charm and readiness to use violence. Rogers represents a particularly dangerous type of predator, one who combined charm with mobility, intelligence with brutality, manipulation with murder. He understood how to exploit vulnerability, how to gain trust, and how to disappear before patterns could be established. His case changed how law enforcement approaches mobile serial killers and highlighted the importance of interagency cooperation in tracking predators who cross state lines. The investigation that finally caught Rogers required coordination across dozens of jurisdictions and represented a new model for pursuing killers who refuse to stay in one place. Here's a tightened rewrite that stays within your brief and length target. As we close our look at Glen Rogers, we're left with an unsettling truth. Predators rarely look like monsters. Rogers targeted women who were alone or vulnerable, masking violence with charm and slipping through communities before anyone realized the danger. His shifting confessions and unanswered claims left families chasing closure that never came, and the full extent of his crimes may remain buried with him. But what if the story didn't end there? Hidden details, overlooked timelines, and lingering doubts still cast shadows over this case, and they raise questions few have fully explored. To uncover those layers and go deeper into the mystery, download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story. Your next chilling discovery is waiting there.